The slave trade was a dark and painful period in human history, marked by the forced transportation of millions of people from Africa to the Americas and beyond. For those caught up in this cycle, it was a devastating experience that left them with few options and little control over their lives. Today, I will discuss more on slave trade, the winners and losers. 1. Slave trade. 2. The transatlantic slave trade. 3. Demand for cheap labor. 4. The impact of slave trade. 5. Winners and losers. Here is a brief overview of the history of the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade, which spanned from the 16th to the 19th centuries, involved the transportation of millions of African people to the Americas to work as enslaved laborers on plantations, mines, and other labor-intensive industries. The slave trade was fueled by European demand for cheap labor, particularly in the New World colonies of the Americas, where enslaved people were used to work the land and produce crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The slave trade was also fueled by the demand for slaves in the Middle East, where enslaved people were used as domestic servants, soldiers, and concubines. The transatlantic slave trade was officially abolished in the 19th century, although slavery continued to exist in some parts of the world until the 20th century. The legacy of the slave trade continues to be felt today, as many African countries and communities continue to struggle with the economic, social, and political effects of centuries of exploitation and oppression. The transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was the first movement of millions of Africans by Europeans and Americans to the Western Hemisphere from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, placed in bondage, and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to work as slaves on plantations and in mines. The slave trade was a horrific and brutal practice that resulted in the deaths of millions of people and had a profound and lasting impact on the societies involved. Cheap labor. Demand for cheap labor fueled the transatlantic slave trade as European and American plantation owners, miners, and merchants sought to profit from the labor of enslaved Africans. The demand for labor in the New World, particularly in the Caribbean and the Americas, was high, as the land was being used to grow cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which required a large and steady supply of labor. To meet this demand, European slave traders began capturing and transporting large numbers of Africans to the Western Hemisphere to work as slaves. This demand for cheap labor fueled the slave trade and perpetuated the brutal and inhumane treatment of enslaved Africans. Impact of slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was a devastating and inhumane practice that had a profound and lasting impact on the lives of millions of people. African men, women, and children were forcibly taken from their homes and communities, torn away from their families and loved ones. They were subjected to brutal treatment and brutal conditions during the Middle Passage, and many did not survive the journey across the Atlantic. Those who did survive were sold into a lifetime of slavery, forced to work long hours in grueling and dangerous conditions for little or no pay. The slave trade was an agonizing experience for the millions of Africans who were subjected to it, and it left a lasting scar on the African continent and the societies involved in the trade. Winners and losers. The transatlantic slave trade was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that had winners and losers on both sides of the Atlantic. On the African continent, the slave trade had devastating consequences for the millions of people who were forcibly taken from their homes and sold into slavery. They were the clear losers in the slave trade, subjected to brutal treatment and a lifetime of hard labor with no freedom or rights. In the Americas, plantation owners and merchants who profited from the labor of enslaved Africans were the winners of the slave trade. They benefited from the cheap labor provided by slaves, which allowed them to accumulate wealth and power. On the other hand, the societies of Europe and the Americas also had losers in the slave trade, including those who opposed slavery and those who were negatively impacted by the economic consequences of the trade. The transatlantic slave trade was a dark and tragic chapter in human history, one that should serve as a cautionary tale for generations to come. The brutal treatment and inhumane conditions endured by enslaved Africans should never be repeated. Yet, despite the abolition of slavery, modern-day forms of slavery continue to persist in various forms around the world. It is imperative that we remain vigilant in the fight against slavery and work to eradicate this deeply harmful and oppressive practice. We must not allow the horrors of the past to be repeated in the present or the future. Let us stand together to condemn all forms of slavery and work towards a more just and equal world for all.